The settlement was quiet that night. Cold winds rushed through the broken alleys and rattled the loose sheets of metal that people used as walls. Most families had already closed their doors and covered their windows. Only the workers returning from late shifts walked under the dim colony lamps, their boots crunching on frozen dirt. Among them was Daniel, a human laborer who carried nothing more than a tired face and a small sack of food scraps from his dinner. He had spent the day fixing old machines, and his hands smelled of grease and metal. He wanted only to reach his hut at the edge of the colony, sit by his own heater and forget about the long hours behind him. But as he walked past the trash fires near the colony's dumping ground, he heard a faint sound. At first he thought it was the wind, thin and broken, but then it came again. It was the sound of chewing, desperate and hurried. Daniel slowed his pace. His eyes searched the dark corners near the pile of rusted cans and burned-out crates. There, close to the flickering light of a dying trash fire, he saw movement. A small figure crouched near the ashes. Its thin arms reached into the dirt as if every speck might hold a treasure. The figure's back was bent, its shoulders sharp, like bones pressing through skin. Daniel stepped closer. The firelight revealed what he had only guessed. It was not human. It was an alien child. Her face was narrow, her skin pale under layers of dust. Two large eyes glowed faintly in the fire's reflection. Her lips trembled as she tried to chew on something too hard for her weak jaws. She had no shoes, only strips of cloth tied around her feet. Her ribs showed through the fabric of her torn clothing. Daniel froze. He had seen aliens before, workers, wanderers, beggars who drifted near the colony walls. But this child was different. She was starving, alone, and fragile. The girl noticed him and hissed softly, pulling back like a wild animal ready to run. Her hands clutched a piece of burned bread she had scavenged from the trash. She pressed it to her chest, afraid he might take it. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The fire cracked weakly between them. Daniel's heart beat faster. He knew the colony's rules. Humans and aliens were not meant to mix. Strangers were not meant to be trusted. Helping one could bring trouble from officials and neighbors alike. Yet the child's eyes, those wide, hollow eyes, seemed to pierce straight through his chest. He looked down at the sack in his hand. Inside was the rest of his meal, a chunk of bread, half a piece of meat, and some vegetables. It was not much, but it was more than she had. Daniel crouched slowly and set the sack on the ground. "Here," he said quietly. His voice was calm, though he was not sure if she understood human words. "Take it. It's food." The girl blinked. Her small head tilted as if she could not believe what she was hearing. Then her thin fingers uncurled from the burned bread. She crawled closer, dragging her body on weak limbs, and reached for the sack. When she touched it, Daniel did not move. She pulled it toward her chest, opened it with trembling hands, and stared at the food inside. For an instant her eyes widened, with something like hope. Then she tore into the bread and meat as if she had not eaten in days. Daniel watched in silence. Each bite seemed to give her a little more strength, but also revealed how truly starved she was. She coughed as she swallowed too fast, yet she would not stop. He could almost feel the ache in her belly. The wind howled around them, lifting sparks from the trash fire. Daniel pulled his coat tighter and looked over his shoulder. No one else was nearby. The colony streets were empty, but that did not ease his worry. If anyone saw him giving food to an alien child, whispers would spread. Whispers had power in the colony. When the girl finished, she looked up at him. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Then slowly she pressed her small hand to her chest in a gesture that seemed older than words. It was gratitude, pure and raw. Daniel stood, unsure of what to do next. He had given her the food and she had eaten. That should have been the end of it. Yet as he turned to leave, his steps felt heavy. Something told him this was not finished. Behind him, the girl curled near the trash fire, clutching the empty sack as if it were treasure. Her eyes did not close. They followed him into the dark, full of questions he could not answer. Daniel reached his hut and shut the door, but the image of her face stayed with him. He lay awake, hearing the storm outside, wondering if she would survive the night. And, though he tried to push the thought away, a quiet certainty grew in his chest. The story had only just begun. The night had been restless. Daniel lay on his narrow bed, staring at the ceiling of his hut, while the wind pressed against the walls. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, those wide, desperate eyes of the alien child by the trash fire. He had told himself that his part was done. He had given her food. That was enough. But no matter how many times he repeated it, guilt kept him awake. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the sky, Daniel gave up on sleep. He pulled on his coat and opened the door to the cold air. The colony was still quiet, but faint sounds of life were returning. Doors creaking open, fires being lit, voices calling for another day's work. He stepped outside and froze. At the edge of the path, not far from his hut, the alien child stood. She looked even smaller in the daylight, her thin arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Daniel felt a strange pull, something between fear and responsibility. But then he saw she was not alone. Behind her stood another figure, taller, weary, and clearly struggling to remain upright. It was her mother. The woman's skin was the same pale tone, though lined with exhaustion. Her clothes were ragged, her hair tangled with dust, and her steps unsteady. Still, her posture carried a trace of dignity, as if she had once lived with pride before hunger stole it away. One arm rested on the child's shoulder for balance, while the other clutched a thin cloth bundle, perhaps all that remained of their belongings. Daniel's heart thudded. He had expected never to see the girl again. Now here she was, with her mother at her side. The girl took a cautious step forward, guiding the woman toward him. When they reached his door, the mother lowered, her head slightly. Her voice was soft but clear. Human. Shelter. The single word carried weight heavier than a full sentence. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He looked from the woman's sunken face to the girl's pleading eyes. The child tugged gently at her mother's sleeve, then turned those same eyes back to him, full of hope. He stepped back without realizing it, his hand tightening on the doorframe. The rules of the colony echoed in his mind. Humans lived inside the settlement. Aliens survived outside the walls or not at all. To bring them in was to invite trouble. Neighbors would notice, officials would ask questions, and answers always led to punishment. The mother seemed to read his hesitation. Her head bowed lower, but her voice did not break. We only ask to stay safe, only for a night. The girl pressed her hands together, copying a gesture Daniel recognized as begging. Her small body shook in the morning chill. He wanted to close the door. He wanted to walk away, to let the colony decide their fate as it always had. But something inside him rebelled. He remembered the way the girl had eaten his scraps like life itself. He remembered how she had pressed her hand to her chest in silent gratitude, and he realized that if he shut them out now, he would never be able to silence that memory. Daniel stepped aside. His voice was firm but low. "Come in." The girl's eyes widened in surprise. The mother hesitated as if fearing a trick, but then followed her daughter into the hut. Daniel shut the door behind them, his heart racing. Inside, the space was small, just one bed, one chair, and a table with tools scattered across it. A heater hummed faintly, casting a soft glow against the walls. To Daniel, it was barely enough. For himself. To them, it must have seemed like a palace. The girl rushed toward the heater, stretching her hands toward the warmth. The mother lowered herself carefully into the chair, her body trembling from weakness. Daniel noticed how her fingers shook when she set the bundle down. Inside was nothing more than a strip of cloth and a cracked cup. He felt a wave of unease. What had he done? His hut was now a refuge for strangers the colony wanted forgotten. If anyone found out, he could lose everything. Still, as he watched the child press her small hands to the heater, her face lighting with relief. The unease was replaced by something else, an unfamiliar warmth in his chest. The mother lifted her, eyes to him. They were tired, but not without strength. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling with both shame and gratitude. Daniel nodded, unable to speak. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the heater and the soft breaths of the child. Outside, the colony stirred awake. Inside, a new bond had formed, fragile and dangerous. Daniel knew his life had changed in that moment. What began as a single act of kindness had drawn him into something far greater. The girl had returned. She had brought her mother. And together, they had brought a choice he could no longer avoid. The small hut had never felt so crowded. Daniel's life had been simple, even lonely. He worked, he ate, he slept. His belongings were few, and silence had always been his closest companion. But now, the silence was broken by the soft shuffle of alien feet and the uneven breaths of two strangers who carried desperation in their very skin. The girl sat cross-legged near the heater, her thin body soaking in every flicker of warmth as if it were sunlight after a long winter. She kept glancing around the hut, at the tools on the table, the patched blanket on the bed, even the dented cup by the sink. Everything seemed new to her, as if she had stepped into another world. Her mother, however, was different. She remained still in the chair, her posture tense despite her exhaustion. Her eyes followed Daniel with careful calculation. She spoke. No words, but her guarded silence was louder than suspicion. Daniel paced the small floor. He could not escape the weight pressing on his chest. Letting them in had been a decision made in the heat of compassion. But now the reality began to settle. If the wrong person discovered this, he could lose his home, his work, perhaps even his freedom. Finally, he broke the silence. "You can stay for now, but only for now." His tone was firm, though part of him hated the harshness of it. The mother's eyes lowered. She nodded slowly, as if she expected nothing more. The girl, on the other hand, smiled faintly and hugged her knees closer to her chest. To her, even a single night of safety was more than she had dared to hope for. Daniel pulled some bread from his cupboard and placed it on the table. "Eat," he said. He noticed the way the mother's hands trembled as she reached for it. She tore it carefully into smaller pieces, giving the first to her daughter before taking any for herself. That simple act spoke louder than words. She was starving, yet she placed her child's hunger above her own. Watching them stirred something inside Daniel. He had seen plenty of families in the colony, but survival often made people selfish. Here was a woman who had nothing, yet she still clung to her dignity and her love for her child. The girl chewed happily, crumbs scattering across her lap. When she finished, she looked up at Daniel with wide, curious eyes. Then she pointed to him, then to herself, then pressed her hand to her chest. It was clumsy, but Daniel understood. She was trying to say thank you again. He gave a small nod in return. He wanted to smile, but he couldn't shake the unease in his stomach. The morning hours dragged by. Outside, voices rose as workers filled the streets. Boots stamped in rhythm, carts rattled over stones, and the sound of whistles marked the beginning of labor. Inside the hut, every noise from beyond the thin walls felt sharper, more dangerous. Daniel knew the neighbors were quick to notice changes. If anyone saw movement through his window or heard unfamiliar voices, questions would come. And questions always spread like fire. The mother must have felt it too. Her gaze darted often to the door, her hands gripping the edges of the chair as though ready to flee. She whispered something in her own language to her daughter, soft syllables Daniel could not understand, but whose meaning was clear. Stay quiet, stay small, stay hidden. Daniel sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. This won't work, he muttered to himself. But the girl heard him. She tilted her head, confusion filling her eyes. He crouched near her, lowering his voice. If people find out you're here, it will be bad. For you, for your mother, and for me. The girl blinked, not fully grasping his words but sensing the weight of them. Her small hands clutched her mother's sleeve tighter. The mother finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "We will not bring harm, only life." Her words, broken but clear, struck Daniel. She wasn't promising safety because she couldn't. She was promising that their presence was born of survival, not of malice. Daniel stood, torn between logic and heart. Logic told him to send them away. Heart told him he could not. The image of the girl curled by the trash fire haunted him too strongly. As the sun climbed higher, Daniel knew one thing with certainty. His hut was no longer just his own. Whether he liked it or not, it had become a place of strangers. Strangers who were slowly becoming something more. And somewhere deep inside, he realized the real danger was not from the colony outside, but from the bond already forming within these thin walls. By the third day, Daniel's life no longer belonged only to him. His hut, once quiet and unremarkable, now carried the faint sound of whispered voices and careful footsteps. The girl moved like a shadow, always near the heater or curled up under the thin blanket he had offered her. Her mother spoke little, but her watchful eyes missed nothing. Daniel tried to keep things normal. He went to work. He greeted neighbors with the same tired nod. He carried his tools as always. Yet inside, he carried a weight heavier than any machine part. He feared that every step, every glance would betray his secret. It didn't take long before the colony began to notice. It started with his closest neighbor, old Mrs. Harrow, who liked to sit by her window each morning. She spotted the faint outline of a figure moving behind Daniel's curtains. She didn't mention it aloud, but her narrowed eyes followed him when he returned from work. Then the whispers grew. Workers at the machine yard asked why Daniel seemed more distracted. Some said they saw extra footprints outside his hut in the morning frost. Others wondered why he carried home more bread than usual. No one said the word alien yet, but the thought hung unspoken in every conversation. Daniel felt it pressing closer each day. One evening, as he returned with his supper, he found two neighbors standing near his hut, talking in low tones. They stopped when they saw him, offered stiff nods, then walked away quickly. He knew what that meant. People were already building stories about him. Inside, the girl ran to him the moment he opened the door. Her small hands reached for the sack of food, her eyes bright with hope. Daniel gave her a piece of bread and she smiled as if the whole world had changed. Her innocence cut sharply against the tension outside. The mother ate slowly, always letting her child eat first. Afterward, she looked at Daniel with quiet understanding. "They know," she said, her voice low but certain. Daniel stiffened. "What do you mean?" She gestured toward the door, her expression calm but grave. "Your people see. They whisper. Whisper grows." Her words chilled him. He wanted to deny it, but deep down, he knew she was right. The colony was like dry grass. One spark of rumor and everything caught fire. The girl, oblivious to the danger, curled beside the heater and hummed softly, a sound that almost resembled a lullaby. Daniel sat at the table, rubbing his temples. He had not thought this through. He had wanted only to save one starving child. Now he was risking both their lives and his own. The following day at work, the tension became clearer. A fellow laborer leaned close to him during break. "You've been keeping busy, eh? Heard you've got company these nights." Daniel forced a laugh, pretending not to understand. "Company? You think anyone wants to share this miserable hut?" The man chuckled, but his eyes remained sharp. "Strange things happen when people get soft. Careful you don't invite trouble." The warning rang in Daniel's head long after. That evening, as he approached his hut, he saw another neighbor standing just beyond the corner, pretending to fix a lantern but clearly watching his door. Daniel walked faster, his heartbeat loud in his ears. When he shut the door behind him, he leaned against it, breathless. The mother met his gaze calmly. She already knew. "You regret?" she said softly. Daniel shook his head. "No, but I don't know how long this can last." Her eyes softened, a flicker of respect shining through her exhaustion. "Kindness always costs, but it changes more than it destroys." Her words stayed with him through the night. He listened to the quiet breaths of the girl as she slept on his blanket. He watched the mother's tired figure resting in the chair. And he wondered if perhaps the real test of humanity wasn't survival, but the courage to care when others turned away. Outside, the whispers spread. Inside, something fragile yet unbreakable had begun to grow. Daniel knew a storm was coming. The colony would not remain silent for long. And when that storm broke, he would have to decide: protect his secret or protect the strangers who had already become part of his life. The whispers had spread like smoke through dry air. What had begun as suspicion soon turned into certainty in the minds of the colony. People talked in hushed tones, convinced that Daniel was hiding more than a simple secret. And though no one had spoken the word openly, the fear was clear. Aliens. Daniel felt it everywhere he went. At the machine yard, workers no longer greeted him with casual nods. Instead, their eyes lingered, sharp and questioning. In the market, conversations halted when he passed by, then resumed with muffled laughter or bitter tones. The colony thrived on order, and anyone who stepped outside its rules became an enemy of that fragile order. Inside his hut, the air grew heavier each day. The girl, though still young and innocent, sensed the change. She no longer hummed by the heater as she once did. Instead, she kept watch on the door, her wide eyes flicking toward it whenever footsteps echoed outside. Her mother's silence deepened too, her sharp ears catching every voice that passed near their walls. One night, as Daniel returned late, he froze at the sight before his door. Two alien figures stood there, thin and shivering in the cold. Their eyes widened when they saw him, filled not with malice but with desperate hope. Behind them, a third figure lingered, coughing weakly into the folds of a ragged cloak. Daniel's chest tightened. Word had spread, not only among humans but among the outsiders as well. The starving had learned there was a human who gave food, a human who opened his door. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting neighbors to be watching. The street was empty for now, but he knew that would not last. He hissed in a low voice, "You can't be here." The tallest alien, with hollow cheeks and trembling hands, lowered his head. "Please, food, shelter." Daniel wanted to shout at them, to drive them away before anyone saw. But then the door creaked open behind him, and the little girl peeked out. When she saw the strangers, her face lit with recognition. She rushed forward and tugged at Daniel's sleeve, pointing to them with urgency. "They are like us," her gesture seemed to say. The mother appeared behind her daughter, her expression grave. She spoke quietly to Daniel. "When hope begins, others follow. One flame, many fires." Her words cut deep. Daniel looked again at the figures. Their bodies shook with cold, their eyes pleading. He knew the colony would not forgive him for this, but he also knew he could not turn them away. With a heavy breath, he motioned them inside. Quickly, before anyone sees. The hut, already small, now seemed to shrink further as the new refugees crowded in. Daniel fetched what little food he had and placed it on the table. The strangers devoured it with the same hunger he had seen in the girl's eyes on that first night. As he watched them eat, Daniel felt both pity and dread. His single act of kindness had become a beacon. Others would keep coming. His hut could not hold them all, yet his conscience could not turn them away. That night, sleep escaped him. He sat at the table, staring at the shadows cast by the heater. The girl slept peacefully, her head resting against her mother's lap. The new arrivals lay curled on the floor, murmuring faint thanks in broken whispers. Daniel's thoughts churned. The colony would notice the increase. More mouths meant more food, and more food meant more questions. Every sound, every cough was another risk. He imagined neighbors reporting him, guards breaking down his door, the refugees dragged outside to die in the cold, and him, punished as a traitor to his own people. But then he looked at the girl. Her small hand rested against her mother's arm, her face finally free of hunger and fear. That simple sight burned away his hesitation. Daniel realized the truth. The danger was no longer just his. The danger belonged to them all. And so did the hope. By morning, the word had spread even further. Shadows lingered at the edge of his street. More figures, waiting, watching. Hungry eyes glowed faintly in the cold dawn light. The human who fed one alien had fed many, and soon he knew the whole colony would have to face the truth. The hunger of the outsiders was greater than the fear of their walls. The night was colder than any Daniel could remember. The heater's glow seemed too small against the weight of the shadows pressing in from every corner. His hut, once lonely and silent, now felt alive with the fragile rhythm of many breaths. The girl slept, near the wall, her head on her mother's lap. Two others shared the thin blanket he had once used for himself. The old woman coughed weakly in the corner, her sound scraping through the silence like a warning bell. Daniel sat at the table, staring at the door. Every creak in the wood, every gust of wind against the wall made his chest tighten. He could almost imagine heavy boots outside, officials standing ready to strike. He knew the whispers had spread too far. Someone must have already reported him. It was only a matter of time before the colony's enforcers came. The mother noticed his restless posture. She rose quietly, moving with the grace of someone long used to silence. Her eyes held shadows of fear but also strength. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You fear the knock." Daniel's jaw tightened. "It's not fear. It's knowing. They'll come. And when they do, all of you will be dragged out. And me along with you." The woman studied him. Then she spoke with quiet certainty. "You chose this not because you must, but because you could not turn away. That choice makes you more human than your laws." Her words cut deep. He had tried to convince himself that this was a mistake, that it had all grown too large. But when he looked at the girl sleeping soundly for the first time in weeks, he knew she was right. He had chosen this, and he could not undo it now. The hours dragged. Outside, the colony's noises faded, replaced by the howl of wind sweeping across the walls. Then sometime after midnight, a sound came that froze everyone awake. Boots, heavy, deliberate boots on frozen ground. The girl stirred, clutching her mother. The others sat up, their eyes wide with terror. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he stood and stepped to the door. The shadows of torches flickered through the cracks in the curtain. Voices barked commands in low tones. "Officials, open the door," a voice roared. The pounding that followed rattled the frame. The refugees, huddled together, their fear filling the room like smoke. Daniel felt it in his bones. This was the moment. He could still save himself. If he opened the door and pushed them out, if he denied them, perhaps the officials would spare him. He could walk away with only shame. But then the girl's eyes found his, wide, trusting, unbroken by fear. She looked at him not as a stranger, not even as a savior, but as something stronger, someone who could not abandon her. Daniel's heart pounded. His mind screamed for reason, but his body moved with something older, deeper. He turned to the frightened group. "Stay silent," he whispered. "No matter what happens." He grabbed the latch, his palms slick with sweat. For a brief second he considered surrender. But the thought of the girl's small hand clutching his sleeve, of the mother's dignity despite her hunger, of every face that had come to his door with hope, those memories burned away his doubt. He opened the door. The torchlight spilled in, blinding him for a moment. 3 officials stood outside, their uniforms sharp against the night. The leader's eyes narrowed. "We've had reports. Too much food going missing. Strange movements at your hut. Care to explain?" Daniel's voice came out steady, though his chest thundered. "Reports are lies. I live alone. I always have." The official's gaze swept past him, toward the faint shadows on the walls inside. Daniel shifted to block the view, his body tense like steel. "You'll let us in," the official said flatly. Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe. He felt the weight of the decision crushing him, heavier than any machine he had ever lifted. To open the door fully was to betray them all. To refuse was to declare war against his own colony. Behind him, the girl's faint breath reached his ears. It was enough. No, Daniel said, his voice low but unshaking. You won't. The officials stepped closer, surprise flashing in their eyes. The leader's face hardened. Think carefully, worker. Defying us is defying the colony itself. Daniel's heart thundered, but he stood firm. Then I'll defy. The silence that followed was sharper than any blade. Torches flickered. Wind howled, and inside the hut, hope trembled like a candle flame. The night of decision had come, and Daniel had chosen. The torchlight burned against the dark as Daniel faced the officials at his door. His body blocked their view of the crowded room behind him. The girl's quiet breathing, the rustle of frightened bodies, all of it trembled in the shadows. Yet, Daniel did not move aside. The leader of the officials narrowed his eyes. One last chance, step away or we force our way in. Daniel's heart pounded like a drum, but his voice was steady. There's nothing for you here, leave. The officials exchanged glances, muttering under their breath. They were used to obedience, not defiance. One reached for his weapon, the torchlight glinting off cold steel. But before the leader could give the order, a sound echoed from the nearby huts. Doors opening, voices rising. Neighbors had come out, drawn by the noise. Men and women stood in the cold, watching. Some crossed their arms, others whispered. A crowd was forming. The official leader cursed under his breath. The colony thrived on control, but crowds meant eyes, and eyes meant stories. Stories spread faster than commands. Very well, the leader spat. We'll return. With a sharp gesture, the officials turned and disappeared into the night, their boots crunching against the frost. Daniel stood frozen in the doorway until their torches vanished. Only then did he close the door, his breath shaking from his chest. Behind him, silence hung heavy. Then the girl ran forward, clutching his coat. She pressed her head against him, trembling but safe. Her mother rose slowly, her voice breaking the silence. You chose us. Daniel looked at the frightened faces, crowded in his hut, the boy, the old woman, the weary strangers who had come with nothing but hunger. I couldn't do otherwise, he said quietly. That night passed without sleep. Everyone stayed awake, listening for returning boots, but none came. By dawn, the fear gave way to something else, resolve. Daniel stepped outside into the cold. Morning. Neighbors watched from a distance. He felt their eyes, their judgment, their suspicion. Yet among them he also saw something new, uncertainty. They had seen him stand against officials. They had seen him protect the helpless. Whispers would continue, but whispers could not erase what people had witnessed. Inside the hut, the girl laughed softly as she shared a piece of bread with the boy. Her mother's tired eyes softened for the first time since he had met her. The refugees had begun to act not as strangers, but as family. Daniel realized the truth he had been avoiding. This was no longer about hiding them. It was about claiming them. If he continued in secrecy, fear would destroy them all. But if he stood openly, perhaps, just perhaps, others would see what he saw. Not enemies, not outsiders, people. By evening, he made his choice. He opened his door wide, letting the cold air rush in. The girl ran to the threshold, staring out at the colony with wide eyes. Her mother placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Daniel faced the street. Neighbors paused, curious. Some frowned. Some whispered. But none turned away. These are my guests, Daniel said, his voice loud enough to carry. They are hungry. They are tired. And they are under my roof. If you want them gone, you'll have to take me too. The words struck the air like a hammer. No one answered. Some shook their heads, muttering about foolishness. But others lingered, their expressions uncertain, even thoughtful. Seeds had been planted in the frozen soil of the colony, seeds that might one day grow. When Daniel closed the door, the girl smiled up at him. Home, she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. He knelt, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. Yes, he said, home. That night the heater glowed brighter than ever. Laughter, faint but real, filled the hut. Fear still lingered, but it no longer ruled. What ruled instead was something stronger, the bond of survival, the strength of compassion, the unyielding spirit of humanity. Daniel knew the colony would not forget this. Officials would return. There would be more trials ahead. But he also knew that he had made his choice. He had built more than shelter. He had built a family. And in the quiet warmth of that fragile hut, among aliens who had once been strangers, Daniel understood why the phrase endured across countless stories and countless stars.